I recently finished this sweater. It is a hand-spun version of the Shifty by Andrea Mowry, and it is a really popular pattern for spinners to use up stashed hand-spun yarn. I love the finished object, but mine was not exactly a walk in the park. So in this video, I'll tell you all about the problems that I had and look at the new updated version of the Shifty pattern in the hope that those issues have been fixed. I'm Bex, and this is a channel all about knitting, spinning, and occasionally some other crafty stuff. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and all of that malarkey. It really helps the channel out. So Andrea Mowry released 3 patterns in the Shift series: the Shift Cowl, the Night Shift Shawl, and the Shifty Sweater, all with the same stitch pattern. There's also the Shift Along hat and a whole section of other mosaic stitch patterns which I think would work brilliantly for handspun, including the Montana Mountain Cowl, which would look amazing in yarn from hand-painted braid. Or if you'd prefer stranded colour work, the Flicker and Flame hat would show off a gradient beautifully. As you may recall, I have previously made the Night Shift, which I will link to in the description, so one of the issues wasn't really a surprise to me, and that was the fact that this stitch pattern takes a really freaking long time. The upside of slip stitch is that it's easier for most people to deal with than stranded colour work because you're only managing one colour at a time, and it produces a really visually interesting, gorgeously light and warm fabric. But because half the rows are slip stitches, you're only really making half the amount of progress that you would in stocking stitch. And I'll admit, this one took more than one turn in the naughty corner because it just seemed to be taking so long. But that wasn't the only issue. Before I get into the other problems that I had, let's talk about the yarn. The pattern sample is knitted in Spin Cycles dyed in the wool, which is a light sport weight. One colourway is consistently used for the background, while 3 other colourways alternate for the blips, which is Andrea's name for the mosaic slip stitch pattern. Because Spin Cycles yarn is designed to replicate hand-spun, hand-painted braids, the colours change throughout the skein. So you can really just use this as a stash buster and just switch out the colours however you like. Spin Cycle is also on the more expensive side of the affordability spectrum, so a lot of people have substituted other yarns. I'll put some options in the description. I did some pretty deep stash diving for this one and ended up with 3 main background skeins. One in shades of magenta to purple, which was actually the first skein I ever spun on my Shat Matchless. One in light to medium blues, and another one in a kind of salmony pink with some purple and blue tones that just kind of pulled it all together. These skeins weren't as consistently spun as what I would produce now, but I do find that this mosaic slip stitch pattern is pretty forgiving when it comes to less consistent handspun. The yarn I used for the mosaic pattern in the yoke was from a Nunoco batt in burgundy, pink and green. I only had a small skein of that and I ended up dyeing some merino silk fibre and spinning up some more. It doesn't exactly match the original Nunoco batt, so I tried to fade the new yarn in, but honestly I could have done with alternating the old with the new much earlier than I did. One of the issues that I know people have concerns about with this pattern is the potential for colour jogs down the back. If you're not familiar with the term jog, that is when you're knitting in the round and you change from one colour to another. One of the colours will just be a little fraction above the other because you're stopping that colour in one row and then starting this one in another row. So there's a very, very slight step. I have to be honest, this was a project where I chose to pick my battles. I knew that just getting through the garment was going to be enough of a mental battle, let alone having to worry about sorting out the jogs. Looking at other people's projects, I think a lot depends on how solid your yarn is and how much it contrasts. In mine, the only place where you really see the jogs is where I change from blue to pink or vice versa. Every other colour change is pretty smooth. But if I was using a solid coloured yarn, I probably would have made the effort to resolve those jogs. I saw some people suggesting that they'd prefer the jog to be moved to under one of the sleeves. I think that's a bit strange, unless you always walk around with your arms glued to your side like Dick Van Dyke doing the penguin dance in Mary Poppins. People are going to see that way more than they'd see the back. The Shifty is knit from the top down, so I was able to try it on as I went. The first time was when I was most of the way down the yoke and it looked like it was all going according to plan. Then when I got a little bit bogged down by how flipping long the slip stitch was taking, I motivated myself by blocking it again once I got partway down the sleeves so that I could try on for size. And that's when I noticed this. This weird bulge happened just before the split for the sleeves and I had to weigh up how to fix it. While it probably would have been quicker just to rip the whole thing back to the shoulders, mentally I'm pretty sure that would have broken me for this project. So instead I decided to do a very Bex thing. I chose to perform sweater surgery because of course I did. I unpicked one row, ripped back to where the problem started and then re-knitted it again. Now initially I thought the bulge was just caused by a thicker section of the contrast yarn, so I respun that singles, drafting it just a little bit thinner that time, re-knitted that section and started grafting it back together with the Finchley graft. Even when I was only halfway through though, I could see that the bulge was still there. So, you know, not the yarn then. That's when I realised that the bulge corresponded with a really significant increase round. Probably should have checked that first. And by significant, I mean a 25% increase in the stitch count. The problem, of course, was that on me, that increase came not in the shoulder area, but partway down my arm, hence the bulge. I didn't really want to touch the stitch count in the body or the sleeves because they were fitting quite well. So I just decided to make that increase a little bit more gradual. Instead of doing all the extra stitches in one go, I spaced them out at the end of the next 4 blip sections and then grafted all 400 stitches back to the rest of the body. Seriously, the Finchley graft is a total godsend. I'd love to know what your coping mechanism is when you're faced with similar challenges. When I have to make a big effort to get through something like this, I have a habit of re-watching TV shows of my teens. In this case, it took 2 entire series of Baywatch before I was back on track. Just a disclaimer, I was only ever interested in Eddie and Shawnee pre-Pamela Anderson era, alright? Just putting that out there. There's definitely still a bit too much fabric in the yoke, which is much more evident on the back, but I think it's passable. It doesn't bother me too much. The rest of the project was much more straightforward. In order to try and have the body and sleeves match as much as possible, I would do a few blip repeats on the body and then those same repeats on each sleeve, breaking the yarn if necessary to try and keep the colour changes the same. Having started it on the 2nd of March 2021, I finally bound it off on the 15th of January 2022. And then there were the ends. Oh, so many ends. A friend suggested that I should wear it inside out and attach feathers as cat toys. I didn't actually wear it like this around the cats, that would have been disastrous. As I said at the beginning, I am really pleased with the finished object, but I know that I'm not the only one who's had problems with the yoke sizing on this pattern. The original pattern does mention that testers recommended 0 or negative ease, but when you browse through other people's finished projects, you can definitely see repeating themes of either sleeve bulges like mine or bunching across the yoke in the same area, which just points to there being too much fabric there. Unfortunately, this issue just seemed to get worse the further you got through the size range, so it just seemed like it wasn't graded proportionally. I do think it's important to swatch for this one as the directions refer to full repeats of the pattern blips. So if your blips are a little bit longer or shorter than they should be, then you're going to end up with the increases happening at the wrong rate. For me, the stitch count in the sleeves and body was absolutely fine, so I think the modification I would have made for future shifties would have been to keep the yoke a bit smaller and maybe just cast on more stitches in the underarm to get back up to the same stitch count. However, shortly after I finished mine, Andrea released a big update for the Shifty pattern to improve the yoke shaping. It's a free update for those who've already bought the pattern, so if you bought it on Ravelry, it should already be in your library. If you bought it directly from Andrea's website, then you can email her with the email address you used or the original order number, and she'll send you the new updated version. I love it when designers really listen to feedback and are prepared to go back and rework patterns even years after their original release. We're all learning new things all the time, and I'm really glad that Andrea was able to apply everything she's learned about round yoke shaping to this pattern. Out of interest, I compared the two versions, and Shifty 2.0 contains a lot of changes from the original. There has been a lot of work put into this. There's a new size 9, measuring 62 3/4 inches or 159.5 centimetres. The short row shaping on the back of the neckline has changed, and the rate of increases has also been altered individually for each size. I did make a spreadsheet to analyse the changes, but it's hard to pick out a particular pattern to the new modifications. From the test knits I've seen, the fit issues in the yoke seem to have been resolved throughout the size range. The body stitch count has been decreased, so initially I was a little confused as to how the measurements on the schematic had actually increased. Very slightly. But then I realised that the recommended gauge had also changed to something that's designed to be a little bit easier for most people to achieve. It does mean that the fabric is going to be less dense, but I think for most people that would be a good thing. Personally, I actually quite like the really warm, squishy fabric of version 1.0, but that is an opinion from someone who is pretty much permanently cold. If you've knit this one before, you should definitely treat Shifty 2.0 as a completely new pattern, or just use the original version to make your own tweaks. Likewise, if someone else knitted the original version, then many of their opinions and modifications may no longer be relevant to the 2.0 version. So that is the Shifty Sweater, a really great option for using up handspun. Just use the updated pattern and don't try knitting it under the pressure of a deadline. I hope that was useful. Check out this video for my recap of the night shift shawl from the same designer. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.